Hi class, welcome to General Psychology at Tarrant County College. I'm your instructor, Kathy Anderson. In this course, we're going to be taking a look at psychology from a very general perspective, where psychology is defined as the scientific study of mind and behavior. That sounds like a pretty dry kind of a definition, right? But this actually has really three important concepts. Number one, it is the scientific study. Everything we're going to discuss in this course will be based on psychological science. There will have been studies done. I'm not going to give you anything where there's just one study. This will be based on a history of studies so that we can get some consensus about the mind and behavior. So the mind, of course, is everything that's going on inside here, in between the ears, in your brain, how your neurotransmitters are firing, how your memory works, how your emotions work, how your personality works, how you interact with other people socially. That begins to get into this idea of behavior, because when we have our neurotransmitters firing and we're a little bit low on GABA, we tend to feel kind of stressy, and that will come out as behavior where we're irritated, maybe with somebody chewing or in the next room doing something that we don't like. So the scientific study of mind and behavior is what we're looking at in this course. So I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the topics that we're going to discuss. This does change semester to semester, so we'll do a lot of these, but we may not do all of them. But you could certainly read in your psych textbook about anything that we do not cover in class. We are going to first start with history and research methods. We've got to get a good solid background in those two areas before we move on to the brain. Then we'll look at sensation and perception. Sensation is how we're taking in information, the colors and sounds and smells, and perception is turning those colors and sounds and smells into something meaningful. You stop when you see the red light. The red light is the sensation, and the perception is, I see red, that means I should stop. Then we're going to take a look at consciousness, where we'll discuss sleep, dreaming, meditation, and also drugs and alcohol. Then we'll take a look at learning. How do we learn? By watching others, by getting rewards and punishments in the environment. We'll think about memory. There we'll have a real practical approach to help you to use your memory system to learn better and remember better in your classes. Then we'll take a look at thinking. We won't do a whole lot on language and intelligence. We'll spend a good amount of time on human development. This is actually my area of expertise. I'm a developmental psychologist, so we'll look at development from sperm to worm, as they say. Motivation and emotion. Why are we motivated to study or not? Why are we motivated to get up and get a Dr. Pepper or jump from an airplane with a parachute? We'll think about emotion. How do we actually experience emotion? What do emotions do for us? I think we're going to skip sexuality and gender in this course because the textbook we're using right now doesn't cover it. Then we will take a look at personality. The idea that there are 5 basic traits that are found across the entire world in all the cultures. We'll also take a look at Freud. And his ideas about the id, the ego, the superego, and defense mechanisms. We'll do some things on stress and health, and we'll learn about how stress impacts the body, how it can be a benefit, but how there's a little bit of a mismatch between the type of stress that we experience now versus the type of stress we experienced hundreds of millions of years ago, and how that can have an impact on our health and what to do about it. Then finally, my favorite part of the course is saved for the end, psych disorders, treatments, and social psych. So psychological disorders, we'll think about some of the more common disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder. And then we'll take a look at how can we use treatments to to help ourselves cope with those kinds of disorders and maybe even overcome them. Finally, we'll wrap up this semester with social psychology. We'll think about how we go from people who are fairly interested in others, and so we will tend to do what others are doing. If you walk into a classroom and somebody is sitting down on the floor instead of a chair, there's a good chance that you're going to do the same, especially if several people are doing it, because you'll look at them and think they must know something that I should know too. Then from there, we'll begin to think about how people might pressure other people to do things, even things that go against their own moral compass. And then finally, we'll think about how the power of a situation that you're in might create norms that are really even dangerous. And so we'll get at a little bit of the explanation for how mobs form and genocides as well. So that's a brief overview of our course. So I want you to take a look at the syllabus. I'm not going to go through it in a video, I don't think, but everything is really clear and laid out. So make sure you take a look at that. I strongly recommend that you have a planner of some kind. It might be your phone, it might be a Google Calendar or an Apple Calendar. It might be a paper planner. That's what I still use. And I keep it next to the table at the dinner table so that I can see it every day. You need to be taking a look at your syllabus, reading through that today, and making sure that you write down all the important due dates. When are readings due? When are quizzes due? When are extra credits due? And when are the exams? So make sure you do that today. So let's get into chapter 1. We're going to, in this video, take a look at just a brief introduction to some key concepts, and then just a little bit on the history of psychology. So we're going to be defining psychology and history of psychology in this video. Then there will be another video for schools of thought, then finally research methods. So what was the definition again of psychology? Do you remember? There were 3 important terms. It's scientific. It is the mind and behavior. So we're going to be looking at the mind and behavior from a psychological science perspective. So where do psychologists work and what kind of specialties do they have? Just a brief look at this. So you can see that most psychologists are working in higher education, but a lot are also working in business or government and in hospitals. These people are going to probably be your industrial organizational psychologists. These are probably going to be your clinical psychologists, and then these are going to be all of them. School psych is a really big growing need in the United States. If you really like this class, I could recommend to you that you go into school psychology. This is an area where you could get a 4-year bachelor's in psych, and then a 2-year program to become a licensed school psychologist. School psychologists in Texas are making 60 to 70 on average. So that's a pretty good income, and it seems like that's being needed more and more, especially since the pandemic, as students have become more touched by anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. So you can see that clinical counseling psychology is the majority of the areas of specialization. And if I were to ask you, what do you think a psychologist is? You probably think of somebody who's doing counseling. But counseling is actually a relatively small part. So independent practice, people who just kind of hang a shingle out and say, hey, I'm open for business, is here. This is clinical, but it's specifically school. This is going to be clinical. Managed care is probably clinical as well. I am not a clinical psychologist. I'm actually in this sliver right here. I'm a developmental psychologist. So I look at how people develop across time, from cradle to grave, or sperm to worm, as we say. So school psych, as the last numbers I had, about 8%. My guess is that this might be a little bit higher. Social personality, cognitive, educational, biological and experimental, a lot of these people are going to be in higher education or maybe in business. Maybe they're going to be working for a company doing research. So psychology, what is it good for? Well, we have 4 things that we try to accomplish in psychology. Number 1, the most basic is we describe. We describe or report what is observed. So if I observe somebody who is extremely emotional, like can go from hot to cold in minutes, maybe experiences suicidal ideation, maybe they cut themselves, maybe their attitude toward romantic interests is, I hate you, don't leave me. Maybe this is a person who acts out sexually, has attempted suicide, doesn't seem to have a core sense of self. If I see a person like that, it might be very interesting to describe these various symptoms and report on what I'm observing. Then I might try to explain, how did this person develop a personality like that? I might organize and understand the observations and behaviors that I'm seeing. I might say, well, it's possible that this is a person who lacks a core sense of self, who was maybe undermined by their parents when they were young. Maybe mom and dad invalidated them a lot. Then I might try to predict what would happen. If a person like this is going to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This is actually one of the most deadly disorders that there are. So I might want to predict what will happen with this person. I might want to predict the behaviors or the outcomes. How likely is it that this person will recover or be able to control their experience? And then that leads us into the last one. Can we control the behavior? Can we use research findings to shape, modify, and control behavior? Borderline personality disorder used to be pretty much intractable. Clinical psychologists didn't really want to work with people who had borderline because it was known that they were difficult patients and that it was an intractable illness. Most recently, though, there has been work by a psychologist named Marsha Linehan. She has borderline personality disorder herself, and she has come up with a strategy for treatment called dialectical behavioral therapy that has been very effective. So there's our 4 things that we try to do in psych. We try to describe a phenomenon, explain it, predict it, and control it. So just a little wee bit here on the history of psychology. So it all starts in ancient Greece. We begin with Plato and Aristotle. This is about 300 years BCE. Plato and Aristotle are thinking about the importance of nature. Plato thinks that we are born with some kind of innate knowledge. Aristotle thinks about the scientific approach to answering questions about emotion, sensation, and perception. He wasn't using the scientific method. That comes much, much later, but he was the first one to begin to think systematically about how can we think about these basic human experiences. Fast forward to the 1600s and we get to Descartes. You may remember from philosophy class that Descartes is a dualist, a mind-body dualist. He thinks of the body as a physical entity, a machine, but he also thinks that the mind is an intangible, separate entity, but that the 2 are connected. So we've got the physical body and we've got the mind itself. We could think about that in today's terms like this. I actually just had this discussion with my kids the other day. I've got 2 kids. They're senior and freshman in high school, and I'm married to a philosopher. So people always say, oh, wow, I bet you have interesting dinner conversations. Well, we don't normally, but sometimes we do, and we had one about really about mind-body dualism and the nature of love. And so I was sharing with the kids that as I learned more and more about psychology, I began to think that, and I was learning about the biological substrates of love, that the early stages of love, you've got a lot of dopamine and natural amphetamines flowing through the brain that motivate you to spend a lot of time with your significant other. And then as we become deeply enmeshed with another person in a significant relationship, we have a lot of oxytocin that bonds us to that person in the brain. And then in our later years, after we've been married for a long time, then we experience what's called natural endorphins. They're basically like opiates. So this kind of deadens the pain that we may be feeling. And so I said I had begun to go to my husband and say, hey, I need some oxytocin. And that meant I need a little hug. And I wanted to feel that bond and that safety that comes with a significant relationship. But then I thought, gosh, is this just neurotransmitters? Am I just my brain? Now, my personal belief, I'm a dualist. I think that the mind, that those feelings of love are not reducible to my neurotransmitters. I think love is more than neurotransmitters. You may disagree. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. All right, so then in the 1800s, psychology as we know it was born. So we go from 300 BCE with Plato and Aristotle, 1600s Descartes, and now in the 1800s, psychology as we know it was born. Do you realize how new that is? That was really, this is a science in its infancy. So Wilhelm Wundt, he is a German, and in German, W's are often pronounced with that V sound. So Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, founded the first psych lab and the first psychology journal in Germany. What's a psych journal, you may be wondering? It is a publication where scientists can write up the research that they've done and share it with the world. Wundt was measuring psychological processes through something he called introspection. He would have patients come in. You can see his apparatus here. He was conducting experiments on reaction time. So he would maybe give somebody an apple, and then he would say, report to me what your experience of the apple is. That's the introspection part. And then he was using objective reports, measuring how quickly people could respond. So you can see this is beginning to be somewhat more scientific. We're looking for objective data that we can look at. So the next data point in our history lesson here is, when does psychology come to America? So this is Edward Titchener. He actually set up the first American lab in the late 1800s at Cornell University. His school of thought was called Structuralism. He also was using introspection just like Wundt. But as you can imagine, introspection is not the most helpful thing. I can kind of look into my mind and tell you it feels hot in my office right now, but that's not going to be real objective, right? And so introspection is not a good founding for a psychological science. So structuralism was the first school of thought to be born and the first to die. But remember, Edward Titchener, 1800s, first lab in America. All right, be glad you don't have to read this guy's textbook. This is William James. He was another towering figure in psychology in the late 1800s. He offered the first psych classes in the United States. He also wrote the first psych textbook. It was called The Principles of Psychology. It was 1,400 pages long. Your textbook is not nearly that extensive. He departed from introspection. He said it doesn't work because thought is like a stream of consciousness. So by the time I'm reporting what happened before, I don't really have access to that anymore. His school of thought was called Functionalism because he was focused on how people function in their environment. So put you in on a soccer field. If you're really good at soccer, you're going to function well. Put me on a soccer field, I'm probably not going to function well. Put you in a dysfunctional home environment, that's going to affect you. Maybe you develop something like borderline personality disorder. Put you in a very healthy home with loving, supportive parents, going to be a different story. You'll develop differently. All right, that's the end of our first lecture, and we will